Feeling bored? Oh, oh. Oh, that's right. It's Friday the 13th. All right. I don't think anybody's got a hockey mask on today. That's true. I didn't even realize that it was Friday the 13th. Oh, okay, cool. Also, in the month of October, has everybody worked out what they want to be for Halloween? No. You know? That's a good costume. I recommend that one highly. Start working on it. It's around the corner. It comes up fast. But I have to tell you, more than one time I got pulled into do a Google search for Halloween costumes that you can come up with in 15 minutes or, something like that. There's all kinds of really weird stuff out there. Did you? Yeah. I bought a ton of candy, so I'm pretty covered in that. I don't know if any kids are going to get any, but yeah, I've got candy. And I like peanut butter cups, so that's happening. So anyway, Halloween aside, hard to put it aside. I think it's my favorite holiday, to be honest with you. Halloween is the best. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about 3DF. Let's talk a little bit about UV mapping. How'd you guys feel about UV mapping last class? You guys did pretty well. I got to be honest with you, in terms of classes we've had in the past. I know Brian noticed it as well. You guys seem to have a pretty good handle on the UV mapping. I think one of the things that particularly helped you out was that discussion board that you guys did, because quite a few of you looked at the UV mapping videos that were available. And, again, a tremendous leg up to kind of review the material before you see the material again in class. And I think that is definitely tremendously to your advantage. I would recommend that any and all times. If you have a class in the future where the lecture material is pre-recorded, or they have stuff they want you to watch before you go to the lecture, I would do that if I were you. That's a great way to walk into class prepared, so that you're not crawling, but you're already in a light jog. So when the material hits you, you can run. So just something to think about. I think that kind of prep work works really well, to the point of where I'm thinking I'm almost going to recommend they watch that video for that discussion board, just to get them greased up and ready to swim, so that when they get to the lecture time, it makes more sense, I think. But anyway, so today we're going to be talking more about UVs. I knew you'd be excited. And today we're going to be delving into some tools that will allow us to sort of massage the Gesundheit, massage the UV shells, and rearrange them, cut them, sew them, and make a better quality layout. Because what we want is happy little squares, and we're going to talk all about how we can make sure we've got the best possible happy little squares to make all this stuff happen. And we're going to get into, if we have time, we're going to get into creating an ambient occlusion pass for our models, which is a great way to show off the details on your models, and it is a aspect of texturing. Not only does it create really nice shadow in areas of your model to accentuate detail, but it also serves as a tremendous guide when you're trying to paint textures, because you can actually use your AO pass as sort of a guide of where the various elements are that you can paint and augment what's already going on in there. So definitely some fun stuff we're going to learn today. And I think the AO pass will reinforce why it's so important to have good UV layout. Because if your UV layout is poor, your AO pass is going to be terrible. So you start to understand the importance of it, even though it is somewhat monotonous. So again, UV layout, we're going to be doing more with massaging the shells and making them work and look better. And what I'd like you to think about is a lot of the terminology that we're going to be throwing around is terminology that you would hear when you're talking about a tailor, because I guess the verbiage is very similar to the ideology of UV mapping, because tailors make clothing for people. cloth is a 2D idea. And what you're doing is you're cutting panels or pieces of fabric to fit over a person, which is a 3D idea, right? So UV mapping is kind of similar to that in that we are creating flat 2D panels of material that will wrap around and fit on a 3D object. Does that make sense? Okay, so a lot of the terminology and a lot of the ideas that you'll be hearing today will sound like terms that a tailor would use because we're basically making a suit for whatever piece of geometry we happen to be mapping. We're just using shells instead of cloth, but it's the same idea. All right, so without further ado, let's get into today's material. I know you're excited, and you just can't hide it. I know I'm about to lose control, and I think I like it. All right, here we go. UV mapping continued. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the quality of the UVs and how we can improve it because we are going to be generating a series of shells, but we can always make those look better. Now, if you take a look at this example here, this image, you can see, yeah, I've pretty much got squares. I've got kind of rectangles here, somewhat rectangles there, kind of squares there, but things that you're noticing is, well, these are much bigger than those. You know, those are slightly bigger than these, but definitely smaller than those. And there's definitely a little bit of stretching going on there. What did we talk about when we said in terms of our UV shells? What does it mean when the squares are different sizes? Do you guys recall what is that? I thought I heard it. Resolution, right? The resolution of those shells are different in terms of their quality. Now, for our class, we want the resolution of every piece of the object that we UV map to have the same resolution, the same quality, because in terms of our end product, we're going to be rendering an image of this product, and we're pretty close to the object, so it needs to have good quality resolution on the entire object. And we're going to be talking more about resolution. But also extremely important, regardless of whether it's this class or not, is that you have the same resolution on the same piece. You don't want to have different resolutions on the same piece of an object because it should have the same resolution. We're going to talk a little bit about that resolution and what that means exactly, as well as what we can do to fix our UV shells. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the Cut UVs tool and the Move and Sew UV tool. And again, the idea here is that we can take UV shells and we can cut them where we want to, and then we can sew them together. Because what we want to do is try to eliminate seams. Do you guys remember when we were looking at that picture of the Earth laid out flat as a map and there were like cuts in the ocean? Those are called seams. We call them texture seams. And a texture seam shows you where the end of a shell is. So when I look at this image, the previous one, I can see the texture seam because I can see these things don't match up. This square does not fluidly transition into another square on this part of the object that's the same size and shape. Does that make sense? I can see where the seams are on this object because the resolutions don't match. It's a giveaway. Does that make sense? The squares don't line up, so you know they're somewhat askew. To give you an idea of seams, if you look at my shirt, you can see there's a very attractive floral pattern on there. But you can see where the seams are on my shirt because the pattern doesn't fluidly transition from front to back. Does that make sense? There's an interruption of the pattern. It doesn't, you know, here's half a flower over here and there's not the other half on that side. So clearly there's a seam. So whenever I take 2D and try to wrap it around 3D, nice and tight, there's going to be seams. You have to have a seam in order to do that. But the key is eliminating seams that you don't need, right? And the seams that you can't avoid, hide them. Because if you look at my shirt, right, are the seams right down the front? No, no, no. They're under the arm because my arm is typically by my side and that hides it. Does that make sense? I get seams across the shoulder. Again, you don't really see that because I've got a transition in shape. I go from my shoulder to the top of my arm. That's a good place to put a seam if I have to have one. Does that make sense? Seam across the top of the shoulder. It's another good spot to have a seam because you don't really see that. Does that make sense? So when we're talking about UV shells, there are probably going to be seams. The reality is you're probably not going to be able to eliminate all the seams. And it's true, there are tools that we can use to paint the seam. It's kind of like the clone stamp tool in Photoshop where we can paint over a seam and it'll actually hide it for us. But the clone stamp tool doesn't always bail us out. So what we have to do is assume that there might be some seams. So we put them in very smart locations to make sure that it's not obvious. I don't have seams in the front of my shirt, right? So I keep them where they're hidden. Does that make sense a little bit? Okay, so that's what we want to think about when we're putting together seams. All righty. Any questions from my digital friends on the idea of seams and what we're getting at with that? And again, as you recall, the seams on the map of the Earth were in the ocean because it's sort of a nondescript blue. Why not have a seam there? Because you wouldn't see. There's no pattern, no continents to be split by that. Okay. No response from online. Okay, coffee for you guys. All right, so we're going to take a look at the move and sew tools and the and attaching the UV shells to each other. And of course, it's an activity which is super fun. I'm going to demonstrate it for you, and then you're going to work on it. But one thing I definitely wanted to touch on again was this idea of resolution, because I really want you guys to wrap your head around what that means exactly in terms of resolution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a picture. This image is of a very low resolution. If you look at the information, it's 128 pixels by 128 pixels, right? That's very low resolution. And what that means is it looks fabulous, right? But as I get closer to it, I start to see what people call the jaggies, right? And what I'm looking at there are the individual pixels that make up this image. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is a low resolution image because I don't have to get very close to it at all. And I start to see the jaggies, the little cubes that make up the image, which is great if you're playing Minecraft. Not so awesome elsewhere. All right? So, again, I don't have to get very close to that image before I start seeing the jaggies, low resolution. All right? Now, let's take a look at another one. Here's another barrel. All right? This is a very high resolution, 4K. It's a big one. Now, when I start zooming in on it, do you see the pixels? Look at how close I have to get before I start to even see the pixels. Eventually, I'll get there, but it takes me a long time because there's a lot of them in there, very densely packed. Does that make sense? That's high resolution. So in terms of quality of image, which is the better quality image? The first oil barrel or the second one? Second one. When it comes to textures that you put on your models, which one do you think will look better, the first one or the second one? The one that has higher resolution is going to look better. Does that make sense? Same thing with pictures you take at home, videos you take at home. The higher the resolution, the better the quality of the image you're looking at. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we are looking at UV shells and we're looking at the little checker patterns on there, we want the resolutions to match. I don't want low resolution attaching to high resolution. I want high resolution attaching to high resolution. Does that make sense? Because I don't want part of it to look jaggy and part of it to look awesome. I want it all to look awesome. Does that make sense? That's why we go for, let's make sure the squares are the same size, because that means the resolution is identical, regardless of how big the shell is. Does that make sense? Okay. So resolution is very important when it comes to quality of texture. They also refer to that as textile density. You'll hear that term come up. And what they're talking about is the resolution of the image. But let's get back to this fun little activity where we're going to use the Move and Sew tool, and we're going to be thinking about resolution while we're using it. So first things first, make sure to set your project to the activity file folder. Got it? And then we go to File, Open Scene, Advanced UV Tools Activity. All right, when you open that bad boy up, you'll see this really groovy marker. And again, you can see that the resolution of these shells is different, / and or incorrect. Now, if I want to see the UV layout of any object, where do I go and what do I do? So I go to my UV editor, so I go to UV, and I choose the UV editor. And there's the editor. Hi, editor. And of course, I have to select the object. So here I'm looking at my UV shells, right, for this piece of geometry, right? Now, I'm going to shade them to make sure they're all facing the right way, because again, the idea of UV shells, if I'm going to be attaching them to each other, they better be facing the right way, right? Because if you look at cloth, you see the outside very vivid, right? Very crisp and colorful. On the inside of my shirt, is it as crisp and colorful? No. They put the ink on the outside, right? So if I'm making this shirt and one panel of cloth is facing the wrong way when I sew it together, is it going to look good or bad? I guess that's perspective. But it's not going to look right, right? I'd like the color, the intense color to be on the outside of every piece. So when we're sewing shells together, they all have to be facing the same way too. And that's why we use that shade UVs, which is it's either image shade UVs or view shaded view, and that will allow you to see the color on the UV shells, so we can make sure that they're not only upside down so that the texture doesn't read backwards, but also so that we can attach them to each other properly. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. So my shells appear to be facing the same way. So now let's take a look at the Move and Sew tools and how we can attach these things to each other. So let's say, for example, I want to attach this shell to this shell. And I know they attach to each other. They're right next to each other in terms of the geometry. I can select an edge in here, and I can see there is one shell, the edge, and then the other one is, let me see where you are. I'm going to activate my Move tool because that will split the difference between the two. Oh, right there. Hard to see. Let me move that out. Actually, I'm going to move both of these pieces out of this area so it's a little bit easier to see. All right. If I select this edge, I see that this edge and this edge light up because they are the same edge. Does that make sense? They're depicted as two edges in the UV editor, but they are only one edge. And it's this one right here. Make sense? So what I know is that the faces on this object, the edges on this UV shell, are going to attach to the edges on this one. And you can see them light up red as I go from one to the next. Does that make sense? I know how they match up. So looking at these two shells, if I sew those together right now, will they match up properly? No, look at this piece is huge compared to this one. Just looking at it, I know they're not going to attach properly when I do it. Does that make sense? So what do you think I should do? Yeah, make that bigger, right? No brainer. Grab this one, and I'm going to use my scale tool and scale it. And watch what happens to the squares on the object as these edges start to become very similarly sized. These are becoming the same size, and what's happening over here? they're lining up. These are becoming the same size too. Now it's true, I've still got kind of rectangles over here, so I'm going to make some adjustments to my scale to try to square them off a little bit. So I've got a square there in terms of the shape, right? All right, and then I'm going to make it smaller so I can see how they're going to attach to each other. And if I get them really close, it looks like they are attached, right? So you can see if I sew those together, that's going to look better, right? A continuous flow of my UV shells from this one to that one. So if I select a shell, okay, those guys are going to go together. Awesome. So I grab these two, and I come all the way over here and double click on those two, and it grabs that whole edge as well as the one below. And then I go to, in my UV editor, you'll notice it's got its own little menu set. I'm going to go to Move and Sew. And it's literally going to take those two shells and sew them together. Does that make sense? In the UV editor, under Cut and Sew, you want Move and Sew. And you'll notice, look at how my squares are now transitioning from this panel to this one in one fluid, smooth move. Those things are connected now. The pattern is continued. Does that make sense? Yes. Oh, if you have the different menu set, thank you. If you have the older version of Maya 2017, thank you, Autodesk, you're going to go under Polygons, and it's down towards the bottom. You'll see Move and Sew. Move and Sew. All right? Now, again, Brian and I will walk around to see how you guys are doing, but I want to show you a couple of things first. So don't panic if you can't do it right now, because we're going to walk around and make sure you can. But what I wanted to show you is how smoothly this transitions and attaches now. Does that make sense? The resolution matches. The transition matches. That's good. I sewed those seams together. Does that make sense? Get a hell yeah on that? Hell yeah. Okay, now, let's look at another instance. Okay? Take a look at this edge right here. Okay? I'm looking at a different edge on my model, part of the same piece. Here's one of the edges here. Here's the edge it's going to match up with. I want to show you something in terms of using the Move and Sew tool. I can click on an edge, double click on the other edge so that it selects the entire edge, selects that entire edge. Okay, they're both selected. And I'm not going to size my shell. I'm not going to move it close to where it's supposed to go. I'm just wherever it is. Again, I go to Cut and Sew, choose Move and Sew, and it will physically attach those things to each other. Does that make sense? It will move it and it will sew it. But if you look at the result I got, you see how I'm starting to see some distortion in there? I might attach two shells to each other and see that and go, oh, that's not looking so awesome. Maybe I shouldn't attach those. But if I sized my shell first and attached them to each other, they attach together very neatly. Does that make sense? So something to think about when you're attaching shells. Do you have to size them first? Do you have to move them near each other and make sure they're going to attach nice? No, not necessarily. But for beginners, I recommend it because you need to know, is it going to attach decently or not? Because if I just take the time to grab that shell, bring it over where it's going to go, and then just size it a little bit. And try to get some happy squares in there. Try to make it look nice, like it's going to attach properly. Then I can do a Move and Sew. It's looking a little bit better. All right, I think I could have even sized that a little bit better. But like I said, Maya will move it, Maya will sew it. But if you've kind of got it the right size to begin with, you see a much better attachment from your initial attachment. Okay? I see a little bit of distortion in there. I can literally grab my UV shells and make a little hand adjustment to the spacing. Does that make sense? Just trying to neaten it up some. Okay? Now I've got a couple more pieces of shell, and I'm just going to delete some of this geometry so you can see it. See, I got some distortion going on up there. Right? But I can attach those to each other. Grab this, go all the way to here. And that's going to select the edges along the bottom here. Move in so. You see I'm starting to get some distortion in there from that. And incidentally, something I wanted to show you guys. Do you see how I've got a seam here? You see that texture seam? That's unavoidable in this instance because we're talking about this edge right here, right? There's a seam there. This is the edge of my material, the edge of my object, because I had to put a seam in there. So I'm going to see that. Does that make sense? I can't attach those to each other. Watch what happens if I try. I select this edge, which is also that edge, which is right where that texture seam is. Move in so. Catastrophe. Does that make sense? It's just like I cannot make a nicely cut Hawaiian shirt out of one piece of cloth with no cuts in it at all and have it fit me nicely. Does that make sense? I could take one piece of cloth and cut a hole in it and stick my head through it and make a poncho, but that's not form-fitting. Does that make sense? It is useful, right? But if I want to be stylish, not going to fly. Does that make sense? So, in terms of the fit, I can't sew those edges together. So here I'm going to put some more. I'm going to sew this other piece on there. Again, I'm not going to adjust it. I'm just going to move it into place. Move and sew. So again, I got some distortion going on in there. I got some issues with resolution. But at this point, at least my texture is attaching to each other properly. I've got a smooth transition. And then we can talk about other tools we can use to improve the quality of the layout. Does that make sense? Okay, so what we're going to do is Brian and I are going to walk around. I want to see that you guys can move and sew shells to each other. All right, and we're just going to double check to make sure you can do that. And then we will move on to the next fun little thing that we need to learn how to do. So move and sew, which is under polygons if you have the older version of the UV editor, and it's under cut and sew if you have the newer version. See, now if you grab all of those edges, it's going to attach that and that and that. So you want to make sure you get just one set of edges. There you go. Get that resolution to match. Playing with the UVs. You having a good time? UVs are crazy. Crazy. Oh, good. You're sizing your shells. Very nice. And make sure you're just selecting the edges between the two. You don't want to get any of these guys out here. It's going to attach other pieces. So go to edge mode and only select the edges that you want to attach to each other specifically. Good, good. Good. How you guys doing? Matching up your resolution. Good. 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 We're going to talk about how we can make that better, but you're going on the right path. Uh-oh. The reason that went all crazy like that is you grabbed all of the edges. Your better bet is to grab just the edges on that one, and that will grab just the appropriate edges on the other one, and those will attach. If you grab too many, it's going to attach things you don't want to grab. So do it like this. Click this one, and then hold Shift and double click the one on the end. Go ahead. Whoop, not, hold on, try that one again. Click that one. hold Shift, and double click the last one. Nope, grab that one. Hold Shift and double click the last one only. Right there. Oh, you got a little bit of the corner, that's why I went all the way around. Yeah, you want to grab just between those two. Good. Ah, good job. All right, looks like you guys are doing this. Pretty good. Not bad. Yes. Oh, that's weird. Download the activity file folder again on FSL. That should be there. It's possible you saved it and named over it or something. I don't know. All right, resolution. Good, good. Try to get those shells together. Good. I see you're playing with the shells. That's good. You got to get used to these guys. If you're going to be working with polygons, you're going to be working with UV shells because you got a map. Very good. So you're starting to see when those shells are the same size, you can see how they'll attach, and that is a better layout.
I'm gonna get like this into the same size.
Yeah, because if this edge is that edge, they need to be the same length. Does that make sense? Good, good. How's it going?
Oh, why is this like this still? Like, this does not look even.
Not perfectly so, but that's what we're going to work on next.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? So at this point, we're just trying to get those shells together and have their resolution agree. Because it needs some help. I need to. Oh, no, no, no. Leave yours like it is. You'll see. You'll see why we did that. But for right now, you're right on point. Yep, you're doing fine. All right, and then what you want to do is make sure that these are similarly sized because that's how they'll attach. Because each edge on this attaches to an edge on that. So they have to be the same length, each edge. All right. What's that?
Like on the top and on the bottom. And not like a couple.
Yes. Yeah, you don't want to attach the top to the bottom.
Oh, but how did you?
I didn't attach the top to the bottom. No. I just attached just actually what you have there. And then I made sure I selected just that edge and attached it, and then just that edge and attached it. That's it. And that's what scooted it in, because if you notice, I didn't size mine first. I just attached it, so it scooted it in. If I had made it the right size first, it would have remained a rectangle. Does that make sense?
I forgot the word.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good, good. Cool. All right. Looks like you guys are doing all right. Good, good. Oh, couple in the back. Yes. Yeah. Yep, you're doing fine. Now, had you those really slim UV shells, if you had made those match the size when they attached, it would be closer to rectangle still. Does that make sense?
Good.
Right. Yeah, that's not bad. Better if they were more similarly sized, but we're going to talk about what we can do to improve that.
Okay.
Yep, you guys are doing all right. Because it's the same edge.
So what should I do?
Well, what you're going to do is you're going to end up attaching those to each other. You're going to try, and try to eliminate the seams. Does that make sense? We want to sew it together. Because you can see right here, I can see the seam, right? That's not attached because that's not a square. It's a rectangle and a really thin one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't have a fluid transition. Just like right here, right, on my shirt.
Yeah. So this one should be always this.
Yep, if you select an edge, just select one, like down there. All right? Grab this one right here. Yep. So this one, wants to attach to that one. So you got to take this and put it up there.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Because that's the top of that one and the bottom of that one.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How you guys doing back there? Good? Okay? Oh, you got one right behind you there, Brian. I don't want to go too far to the back. I might lose my signal on my Bluetooth headset. Well, it stops working, which freaks me out. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, it's a little distorted, but that has to do with how well you size the shells before you sew them together.
Okay.
Does that make sense? If you didn't make sure they were the same size first or super close, you're going to get some distortion like that. But we're going to talk about what to do to fix that next. All right, looks like you guys are doing all right. Good.
That's after he moved it.
Cool. All right. So it's looking pretty good. You guys are doing all right. Some of you are seeing some distortion, and that's okay. Yeah, you're doing okay. Just make sure that this shell is not on top of that one. Just take that skinny one and move it up. Grab the UVs, and you got to move that one up so they're not on top of each other. All right. Now, guys, something I want to show you about the attachment of this shell. Do you notice how the bottom of this, most of this shape looks very rectangular, right? But at the top it's narrow. If you look at how big this is, and if you look at how big this is, and this definitely goes there, right? Because if I select these edges, those guys light up. So the top of this goes to the bottom of that. This is smaller than that. That's what leads to the pinching. Does that make sense? If I make sure that those shells are closer in size, it won't pinch like that. So if I go over here and grab my UVs, grab that shell, move it over here, you see that's not going to fit. It's way smaller. Does that make sense? And that's why it pinched like it did on the top there. But if I take this thing and I make it a little bit bigger so that it's closer to the size of the thing I'm going to attach it to, and then I do my attachment, I'm not seeing that. Does that make sense? It didn't pinch. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is how do we improve the layout? There's some pinching. How do I fix that? But will you necessarily always have pinching? No. Does that make sense? The way you sew those shells together will determine the layout you get. Does that make sense? Okay. So things to think about when I'm sewing my shells together. Now, is this the end of it? I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do to make the layout better? No, not at all. We have some other super tools that will help us out. And the way they work is a lot like ironing. Anybody ever ironed a button-down shirt before? Okay, if you've ever ironed a button-down shirt, I hate ironing button-down shirts. It is a tedious task. So the first thing that I do when I'm ironing a button-down shirt is I throw that thing in the dryer, I set it for a high heat, and I let it bang around in there for a while and get as many wrinkles out as I can. Right? Then I'm going to put that shirt on the table, with a towel or something, because I don't even own an ironing board, and I'll take an iron out, and I will spot iron the areas that need a lot of attention. Collars, right? The venting of the sleeve. The venting between the shoulder blades, that neat little shape that they cut into the shirt. The specialty areas, I'm going to hit those with the iron to give it more attention. Does that make sense? Okay, there's some tools when we're UV mapping that work much the same way. They help to take out the wrinkles. They smooth out the material. And basically what they do is use a mathematical formula or algorithm to take a look at your UV shell, take a look at the 3D object, and try to make them match more evenly in terms of the spatial relationships. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a Maya, please fix this a little bit button. The important thing is you have to take it a good chunk of the way there, and then Maya will do the rest pretty easy. If Maya's not sure what you're doing, you might not quite get the result you're looking for. Does that make sense? It's not a bail me out. You know, you kind of have to do some work up front, but it will improve the quality of your layout. But let's talk about that a little bit. All right, moving and sewing shells. Again, the next thing we can do to improve our layout is a lot like ironing. We are going to use the Smooth UVs tool and the Unfold 3D tool as two terrific tools for helping improve the quality of your layout. All right, now, in terms of which one do you use? Either one, give them a try. Try one, then try the other. See which one gives you the result that looks the best for what you need. And that's the key, is for what you need. Now, in terms of these two tools, we're going to go play with them right now. So we're going back to this activity, and we're going to use that Smooth UVs and the Unfold UVs also. Now, in terms of these tools, again, they work on UVs, so what you want to do is go to UV mode and grab your UVs, right, for whatever shell you're trying to unfold, or Smooth UVs, whichever one. If you go to Tools, you'll see the Smooth UV tool. All right. This is another one of those fun tools that has sort of a interactive capacity to it, and that's why I like it. So when I run the Smooth UVs tool, you'll notice it has two capacities, Unfold and Relax. I'm not a tremendous fan of Relax. I'm a much bigger fan of Unfold. So this is the one that I typically utilize. And the way you use it is you hold down the left mouse button over the word Unfold, and then you actually move your mouse left or right, and you can see it sort of mathematically unfolding the geometry. And what I like about this tool in particular is it offers you a progression. You can crank it all the way to the right, you can leave it where you had it, or you can just sort of drag until you get what you want, something that will do what you need it to do. Does that make sense? You can stop at any point. Other tools, it's kind of an all or nothing. Does that make sense? So you can find a decent layout. Now, in terms of the tool and what it did, you'll notice that my layout looks a little bit better, all right, in terms of overall. My seam is not so bad. And again, why is my seam right here? Well, because I'm going to be, when I render my final product, I'm going to see this side of the marker. So I make sure that the seam is away from the camera. Does that make sense? If I was going to be rendering a movie, right, the camera moves around. Maybe I see both sides of my marker. Guess where I'm going to put the seam then? On the bottom, right? I'm going to put it down here so that it's hidden. Does that make sense? So where do I put the seam? Well, what angle am I going to see this thing from? Does that make sense? Again, things to think about. Where do I put the seam where it's an intelligent place? Yes? That's a terrific question. Let me do that after I do this. Let's take a look at this situation. All right? Right now I've done some unfolding to try to make this look better, and it does look better. I've got a little bit of distortion down here at the bottom. That's not so bad. But overall, I'm looking at fairly fluid-looking squares, fluid transition between what were separate shells before, and they're all uniformly set up in terms of their resolution at this point. Does that make sense? This is an improvement. But there is a price. If you look at this layout, Do you see how it's kind of curved a little bit? There's a little bit of a curve to it. So something I have to ask myself is, in terms of this layout, if I have, this is a marker, right? If this marker has a logo on it, right? If there's some kind of writing on the side of this marker, right on this piece, right? And that writing goes right through this area, which corresponds to this area. If it says Markero on there, the greatest marker ever, right? Text is part of the texture. When I try to put text on this using an application like Photoshop, is Photoshop going to, by default, create text that will fit this curvature? No, it won't. I'm going to have to distort it to make it fit. Does that make sense? Because if I want that to look straight on the marker, and because my UV shell has some curvature to it, I'm going to have to curve my text as well. Luckily, we can do that. That's not that hard. But here's the thought process. If I really need to get text on my UV shell, right, and it's important that it's legible, and I don't want to have to mess with it by distorting it using tools that do that, because sometimes that makes the letters look not quite right. It distorts them as well a little bit, because it's just a graphic. So instead of bending that, maybe I say to myself, I don't want to use my Smooth UVs tool because I want the text to be nice and crisp and perfect, because that's important, because I'm going to be really close to this object right here, and I want to be able to read the text and have it look neat and clean without distortion of the text itself, the letters. So maybe instead of using the Smooth UVs tool, I just make sure my shells line up really well like they did before and leave it in that nice perfect square that it was before. Does that make sense? Because that layout was good enough. It wasn't spot on perfect, but it was good enough and it wouldn't distort the text that I'm trying to apply. Does that make sense? It's kind of a deep thought there. But what you have to think about when you're creating your UV layout is, what does the texture look like that's going to go on this thing? Because that will affect the way you choose to do your layout. Where's the camera going to be? Because that determines where you're going to put the scene. Does that make sense? All things to think about. Which one's the right one? Well, what are you trying to do? You know, from the very beginning of this class, one of the things I talked a lot about, what do I need this thing to do? Gives you the answers you need to start doing your job. And the ability to ask questions. Because now you know, okay, if I have to do this, then would you like this or that? Does that make sense? There's a thinking process to UV mapping. And it's not A, B, C, it's done. UV mapping is an exploration. It's a journey. You're trying to solve the puzzle. No two pieces of geometry will UV map the same. The result is different every time. You have to figure it out. It's like a riddle. Does that make sense? Okay. So this UV layout work. Again, if I just have texture or scratches or, you know, that won't make any difference. But if I have text, that might not necessarily be the way I want to go with it. I might want to leave it as I did before, where everything is a nice, perfect, you know, and I don't like to use the word perfect, but nice, straight-ish looking layout, you know. And again, I can grab those UVs and use my scale tool to make sure they're nice and flattened out. All right, nice straight lines, and then my text will fit right in there and look terrific. Does that make sense? Again, just things to think about. Now, let's look at another tool that does pretty much the same thing, the 3D Unfold tool. Now, the 3D Unfold tool, again, the whole purpose is look at the object, look at your UV layout, and try to make it better if it's possible. And it uses a mathematical equation, but this one is sort of an all or nothing. You grab your UVs, and this one's under, I think it's under Modify. Yep, Modify, Unfold. They love to move the stuff around in the UV editor. They've been messing a lot with that lately. And in terms of the Unfold, there's two versions, Unfold 3D, which is the new version of the tool, and if you choose legacy mode, that's if you're used to using the old version of the unfold tool. But you can just leave it at unfold, and you hit apply and close. Boop. And you'll see this is the layout I got. All right? And if you look at that, that does look more like you would imagine this piece would look if I cut it and splayed it out flat, right? That does look more accurate. But you can start to see, well, yeah, that looks better, but it looks like there's a little bit of sort of pinching. Do you see in this area there's some pinching? Everything's kind of funneling in a little bit there. Does that make sense? So yeah, if I took this piece of geometry and laid it out flat, it probably would look more like that, you know, because this is a complex shape. But ultimately, again, if I'm going to be putting text on this, this is going to start getting very hard to do, right? So a lot of the question, which tool do I use, has to do with, well, what does the texture look like ultimately that's going to go on this thing? Does that make sense? Seriously? Or you just agree? Okay. I'm hoping it's making some sense. These are second and third tier thoughts when it comes to the UV editor. Okay? I'm putting them out there because I'm one who firmly believes in the idea that if you hear some terms and you start to understand them, the next time you hear them, you're not struggling with those terms. You're more dealing with concept at that point. Does that make sense? This is stuff that will impact you much more so as you move through the program. Because do you think you guys are going to be UV mapping ever again?
Oh, yeah.
Every piece of polygon geometry you build from this class forward for Shizzle. So you need to learn how to do this. So I'm trying to get those ideas in there. I'm planting those seeds so that when you guys get further along, okay, I get it now. I'll come right back. Go ahead.
So when we're doing this, it's not that we're trying to keep the squares perfect. It's a bit of what the texture is put on top of it.
Yes, absolutely. You want it as good as you can get it. Always the best you can do. You know what I mean? You never do less than your best. But in some instances, one scenario is better for your situation than others. Does that make sense?
Just because the squares are perfect, it might not work like that.
Exactly. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, that is mathematically more accurate in terms of what that shape would look like if I laid it out flat. But you can see there's some distortion going on there. So if I've got a texture laying on this, that might not read as well as I'd like. Does that make sense? But in other instances, that'll be fine. You know, if this thing is just solid black, like marker caps usually are, with like some scratches in it, maybe some bumps and dings taken out of it using normal maps or bump maps or whatever I want to use to get that to happen, that's going to be fine. But if I've got text right there, maybe not as much. Could you? Absolutely. Take a look at this idea. I'm going to get this shell back over here. Could I just grab these UVs, right, just those guys, and use the Smooth UVs tool and just kind of work those guys a little bit? Yeah, that's that spot ironing thing I'm talking about. Does that make sense? What's not selected doesn't get modified. So you may want to iron this area, but not that one. But typically what I'll do is try to iron the whole thing, see what that gives me. Undo it. Maybe now just this section. Maybe I need to cut and sew different pieces together. Maybe I need to put a cut in there to allow it to expand like it should. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of things you got to think about when you're putting these shells together in terms of what gives you the best result for what you need specifically. Okay? Again, it's weird, some of those thought ideas, but we got to work it. We got to figure out what's going to give me the result I want, the closest to what I need for the job I have to do. because again, I still want a nice layout ultimately, and that looks pretty darn good. No, I've still got this nice crisp seam here. That's going to happen. But what, the shell?
Yeah, like whenever I was moving it, like pyramiding.
Oh, okay. Well, it has to do with where and how you unfold it. You know what I mean? It has everything to do with what you have selected. Yeah. Again, closer to accurate in terms of the shape, but not necessarily going to help me maybe with my texture. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you kind of have to, again, it's a thinking thing. You have to solve this puzzle. It's not a click this, click that, it's done. There's math. You know, the wheels have to turn. You got to be doing stuff. So that's what allows you to make a good choice. Now the question came up, well, what if this isn't a still picture, right? And I'm going to see that marker from more than one side. Because right now it's set up for a still shot from right where we are. I'm not going to see that seam because it's on the other side. But what if I need to move the seam because the camera moves? Maybe it's a shot in motion, and I'm going to go around. Look at this awesome marker. It's fabulous. Let's see the other side, too. So now I've got to move the seam because that's not a good location for it. So moving a seam, very similar to the processes we had going before. Let's say I want to put the seam right here on the bottom. I select the edge. That's the edge I'm talking about. Does that make sense? In my UV editor. And what I can do is literally select this edge. Ooh, you don't want to select, you little nut. Here's the bottom. So what I'm going to do is select this edge right there, and then select this edge, and then this one. And what I've done is selected from one end to the other where I want the seam to be, right? So now I'm going to go to cut and sew, and I'm going to choose cut. And it's literally going to cut my UV shell right where I put that splice. So now this is a separate piece. So if I want this to be where the seam is, then I need to attach this over here. Does that make sense? Because when I select this edge, I don't want to have two seams. So now this goes there. So I can take this piece, move it over this way, and then guess what I'm going to do when I'm over here? Now I'm going to go to move and sew. And then now my texture seam is not on the right side, it's not on the left side, it's on the bottom. And now that I've resewn those things, you know what? Maybe I need to run a smooth UVs on it. Does that make sense? Again, it's a process. It's a series of steps that take place. You have to cut things, sew things, move them around, reattach them, unfold them, don't unfold them. Does that make sense? You don't know what the answer is. You got to figure it out. It's a journey. And we have to do this with polygon geometry. Because if we're going to be applying textures, that's a no-brainer. You're going to be applying textures. If we're going to be utilizing normal maps, if we're going to be using bump maps, heck, spec maps, dirt maps, whatever we want to apply to our geometry, we're going to need to lay out the UVs in order to be able to do that. Right? You guys have heard of ZBrush, right? Okay, ZBrush is an extremely powerful tool for modelers, and to be honest with you, pretty much a given going to be in your production pipeline. Bad UV layout causes the geometry to evaluate very poorly in ZBrush. Very poorly. So we got to have a good layout for that. You guys heard of Substance Painter? It's another awesome application that utilizes UVs to generate textures and materials. Does that make sense? Bad UV layout is going to cause problems. So when we model with polygons, UV mapping is a thing for everybody. And if you are a polygon modeler, you will be laying out the UVs of your model for sure. And also a very high likelihood you're going to be the texture artist as well. So you learn texturing when you get into shading and lighting. But does that make sense? Why we do it? It's not fun, but we have to do it. It's part of our job. You can do that. If you guys remember, do you remember last class? The question was, can I remove the seam by scaling it a little bit? If you guys remember last class, we UV mapped the cylinder and the label didn't match up quite right. And I took the ends and I tucked them in a little bit and moved the edges a tiny bit to kind of get them to line up a little bit better. And it did hide the seam very well. Yeah, that's something you can do once you get to the stage where you have a texture. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, UVs are kind of complicated. I'll give you that. They're not obvious like some other things. But they're important that you understand how they work, because they will affect your life as a polygon modeler. Sorry, I can't hear you. It's working? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so any questions about unfolding, smoothing? Does that make sense? Cutting and sewing, why we do it? Again, we're making an outfit for whatever object it is. And like I said, I prefer the Smooth UVs tool because I like the interactive component of it. So you can kind of drag a little bit and say, oh, that looks good, that looks good. Oh, that's starting to look bad. I'm going to go back to where it was looking better. Does that make sense? Versus an all or nothing. Good? Hell yeah? Okay. That's probably about the best hell yeah I will get when we're talking about UVs. So I will take it. All right. So again, the goal here with our UVs and all that struggle is ultimately it will allow us to create a decent UV layout for our object. And again, we want the squares to be the same size throughout, and again, minimize distortion. The areas that have a printed texture or a text or something that would read, got to be clear. Areas that don't really have a complex texture component to it, not as critical, so you can get away with it if that doesn't turn out great. Does that make sense? So, all about good layout. Now, this next thing we actually did already. Last class, we talked about the idea that once we have our UV shells laid out and we get them back into our 0 to 1, we can then apply textures. Again, we did that last class with the soup can and the monkey cage and the picture. The idea that we could line these things up and get them to match. And again, this is what we did last class, was we got those textures all lined up on the different objects. And again, we went ahead and did that because you guys were actually doing so well with it. We would have done that today had we not done it already on Wednesday. But in terms of texturing, again, well, why do we go through this arduous task of UV mapping? And that's so we can apply textures. Now, I am going to show you guys, because I think we have enough time, how to do an AO pass, or an ambient occlusion pass. And what that does is it helps accentuate detail on your model. And if you look at the jar, You see that nice shading going on there at the top and the bottom of that little bulging sort of ripple there just below the neck of that thing? There's some nice shading in there. And what that is capturing shadow detail. And that's what the ambient occlusion pass is. It's commonly referred to as the dirt pass or the speck pass. But what it does is it makes objects look a little bit more realistic because we incorporate some self-shadowing in there. So let's take a look. What the heck is ambient occlusion? If you make a fist right now and you take a look at the top of your knuckles, and do you see the little tree with 3 branches on it? All right, it looks like a Charlie Brown tree. You see, like, this is the surface of the ground, and that's the tree coming up out of it. Come on, this is a Rorschach test. You guys don't see the tree? That's the ground. Here's the little tree with its 3 branches. All right, now, when you look at the top of your hand like that, what you're looking at is some self-shadowing. Parts of your hand are casting shadows on other parts of your hand, and light can't quite get in there. Does that make sense? If you get really close to a bright light, there's some areas that light can't get into. And what that is detail. It accentuates the detail, because when dark meets light, we see depth, right? That's how a 2D image looks 3D when we look at it, because the light, highlight, and shadow information gives us the illusion of depth. So the ambient occlusion pass is designed to figure out, record, and save the shadow information on your object. And so basically what it does is it looks at your model and says, okay, when light is shining on your model, we're getting some shadow here, and we're getting some shadow here, and it saves that information. And they call it a dirt pass because it makes your objects look a little dirty and a little grungy, because the reality is objects in our world are a little dirty and a little grungy. They don't look perfectly pristine. And again, this makes it look a lot better. Now, let's talk about creating an ambient occlusion, the steps, and we're going to do that for our jar. So it should be exciting. All right. Now, the way I'd like you to think of the ambient occlusion, are you guys familiar with photography, old school photography, and how it works? You take photographic paper, right? You take it into a dark room, right? Light exposes on the negative. It reads the highlight and the shadow information, and it basically burns it into the paper when you add the chemicals to it. And it's just looking at highlight and shadow, and it's sort of baking it or burning it into the paper. Does that make sense? Old school photography. The way the ambient occlusion works is we're basically taking your geometry, whatever it is, and we're applying photographic paper to the entire object. The whole object is made of this special material which records where shadow goes on your object. That's what it does. It just records it. And it remembers it on a face-by-face basis, which faces get shadow and how much. And from that information, it creates a flat image. Again, a representation of your 3D object in 2D, and it creates a texture from that with the shadows drawn in where the shadows go. Does that make sense a little bit? Special material that remembers where shadows fall on your object, and it makes a texture from that. Does that make sense a little bit? Okay. Let's take a look at how that works. We're going to create an AO pass for your jar. So you guys, we will be using, and I'm going to go into, oh, it's going to be in your skill check folder. So I'm going to go, it's in my skill check, right? Yeah, it's my skill check. So I'm going to go to my skill check files, scenes, and I have I believe it's the UV mapping is the one I want. Let me open it up. Oh, no, it's not been mapped. Okay. Well, luckily you guys, if you recall, your last skill check was UV map the jar, right? You remember that? So you got to break out that file to do the activity because you need to have a already UV mapped model. I'm going to see if I've got one in there. No, I don't have my map laid out, so I'm going to have to do mine. Uh-oh, Maya didn't like that. Yes? Just decided it had enough? All right, so here's my jar. All right, do you guys have your jar out? Yes, please get your jar. I would appreciate it. Jar, 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 jar. Ha ha.
I'm pretty sure you won't let me do it.
Oh, I see. All right, buddies. My apologies. I didn't have that set up in advance, but here we go. All right, so in terms of my UV layout, did you guys notice? What are the things I made sure I did? I made sure I flipped everything so it's blue. What else? Scale from the center when I'm making things bigger or smaller, unless I'm trying to adjust the shape of the squares. Sometimes I'll scale from the other axes to make them more square-like. Using as much of the 0 to 1 as I can, make it big. I can even make it bigger to make it fit more. Incidentally, why do you think I would want this to be as big as I can in this space? Why would I want that to be as big as I can? Because I could fit it in there very small. Why would I want it to be big? More squares on it? Absolutely. The bigger it is, the more squares fit on there. And what does that correlate to? Resolution. Does that make sense? If my UV shells all fit into this little area here, I'm going to have very low resolution. Does that make sense? The bigger I make it, the higher the resolution. Make sense? Now, what will probably blow your mind is the fact that I determine ultimately what the resolution of the 0 to 1 space is. That's up to me. This can be 128 by 128, like the smaller image we were looking at of the oil barrel. I can say that this is 4,000 by 4,000. Still my call. Does that make sense? I determine the resolution ultimately, but Maya's going to look here to figure out how many pixels fit in each one of these shells. More pixels, higher resolution. And that's why you want to use up all of this real estate. Does that make sense? Pixel density. How dense is your image? I determine the resolution, but if my shells are small, I'm not using all that resolution I'm paying for. Does that make sense? It's like ordering a meal and you only want one French fry. That's a huge waste of money. Pixels, resolution, that's money, right? So that's why I want to make sure that's as big as I can get it to fit in there, but I make sure the squares are the same size on the entire object. Resolution has to match from piece to piece. But all of them fit into the 0 to 1, and I want to make sure I'm using as much of that space as I can, because anything I'm not using, I am wasting. But you will notice that I change the shape or the position of the objects together. I don't scale just some of them. They're all moving at the same size because I'm trying to maintain the same resolution throughout. Everybody good on that? There's, again, some hard ideas in there, but really, really good ones. Okay. So let's take a look at the process of generating an ambient occlusion pass. Let's see if I can find these guys. I'm looking at some red right here. And I'm wondering where that is. Ah, there you are, you little stinkers. See those guys in there? That's why they're showing up red over here. See, I might have missed that had I been just going along my merry way. But I'm going to come in here, I'm going to grab those guys. and I'm going to see if I can smooth them and get them to do what I want. Get them to go the right way. There they go. Now they're all blue. You see that? That would definitely lead to an issue when I tried to create the AO pass for this thing, because some of my shells were upside down. Does that make sense? Would not read the information properly. All right. So now that everything is blue, everything's pretty happy, I'm going to go ahead and create that ambient occlusion for the jar. And this is something you guys will do in class together, and then you're going to have a more complex object to do at home. Okay, good. We have enough time. All right. So when it comes to creating an ambient occlusion path, these are the steps for the creation of an ambient occlusion path. There are several. You need them all. But ultimately, you will have the AO path for your object. First, we have to turn on the Arnold renderer. We're going to talk more about rendering engines and what they mean exactly next class. But what I want you to know at this point is when we render, we're creating a picture that your computer is drawing. So we have to tell it how to draw the picture. You know, are we using pointillism? Are we doing black and white? Are we doing color? Does that make sense? Different ways of creating an image. Well, our rendering engine is going to do that for us. So first we have to create, or we have to turn on the rendering engine. If you go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, you will launch Maya's Render Settings window. By default, Maya defaults to Maya Software as a rendering engine. And that's just what it uses to draw pictures with, which is fine. Those are pretty cool. Again, in some instances, that actually looks pretty good. Software renders are actually pretty fast. I don't know if you guys have seen Race to Dragon's Edge. You guys have Netflix? Yes, How to Train Your Dragon, Race to Dragon's Edge. I don't know for sure which rendering engine they're using, but that's a very software-looking rendering engine in terms of the quality of the image you're getting. But software is what it defaults to. What we want to use, though, is something called Arnold. Arnold as a renderer. And it's built into Maya, but it's not part of it by default. We have to turn it on. You'll notice from the drop-down, it's not even an option. Make sense? So what we have to do is load it. So we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. The Plugin Manager is a window in Maya that houses all of the third-party plugins. And a third-party plugin is basically something that was built to work with Maya, but it was made by a different company. But they made it so it matches, kind of like accessories. Somebody else made it. Like you and I could create a plugin and make it so that it works with Maya. Yeah, not my application, but what I made will work with it. Does that make sense? Basically. So, third-party plugins are housed in the Plugin Manager. You just have to turn them on. So we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. In the Plugin Manager, you will see many things are not turned on. Things without checks are not turned on. You think Maya takes a long time to load now? Imagine if everything was turned on. Yeah, hassle. So what we're going to do is scroll down, and you will get to an area towards the bottom where you will see something called MTOA. MTOA. That is the Maya to Arnold bundle. If you downloaded the link I gave you, it's there. If you don't see the Arnold, you got to download the link I gave you, and then you'll have it. Maya to Arnold bundle. All you have to do is click on Loaded, and then hit Refresh. Once you've done that, Arnold is now loaded as an option. And you'll know it's loaded because when you look at your main interface, you will see Arnold appears as one of your main menu items. Does that make sense? You turn it on, and then it's ready to go. Lucky you. So now that it's been turned on as an option, we go back to our rendering window, rendering editors, render settings, and we choose from Maya, Arnold. Now Arnold is loaded. Does that make sense? Yeah. Got to turn it on because that's what we're using. Got to be Arnold.
Is that something that you keep on, or is it better to go back to Maya?
You can leave it on. It may turn itself off. I honestly leave my copy of Maya at its defaults at all times because every time I teach another class, I don't want to have anything that's on automatically and I'm taking for granted. Does that make sense? I want to have a copy of Maya just like the one you guys have so that I have to do the things you have to do and I don't miss any steps. Thank you. I'm glad you appreciate that. It makes my job way harder. I got to tell you. Everything takes forever. I don't use hot boxes, marking menus, nothing. I do everything the slow way on purpose because it makes it easier for you to follow. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you guys appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so we've got everything set up here. Arnold is ready to rock and roll, so now we can utilize it. Now, if you guys remember, I told you what we're going to do is create a special material that remembers light and shadow information, right? Right? That's what it does, is record shadows. So if I'm making a new material, where do you think I'm going? Hypershade to the materials area, right? I need to make a new material. And now that I've activated Arnold, I have special Arnold materials available that were not visible before. Does that make sense? That's why you got to turn that on first. So, Windows, rendering editors, Hypershade. And again, we're back to the Hypershade. Good, thank goodness we know how to use this, right? And you'll notice that there's a section now called Arnold. And if you click the very bottommost category of Arnold, Shader, you will see that right up at the top is the AO, or Ambient Occlusion, shader material. So the next step is you click on that to create it. Oh, is that what it is? AI? Is it? Oh, I guess it is. All right. They can't spell. All right, so here's the special material here, right? There it is. How do I apply a material to an object? Middle mouse button drag. Do you see why I make you do these silly little exercises? This stuff comes up again and again. So middle mouse button, drag and drop. Now my jar is made of this material, this special material which records shadow information on a face-by-face basis. Okay? 6. Yep. The checker goes away because now it's not made of the checker material anymore. My UVs are laid out. Now I'm trying to capture shadow information. So a different material does that. So now I got my material on there. Okay? Now that I've got that on there, it's time to ask Arnold very nicely to record that information for me. So the next step, yes. AI material, it's AI ambient occlusion. It's at the top if you select shader, the topmost one. All right. Now, in terms of the steps for creating the AO path, select the geometry. The geometry has to be selected. Very, very important for you to remember. How many pieces of geometry is this object made out of? 1. So I just have to select the one piece and everything's going to be fine. If I am creating an ambient occlusion pass, an AO texture, for an object that is made of many pieces, what I want you to do is select all the pieces and go to Mesh Combine and combine it into a single piece, and then that's what you're going to create the pass for. Does that make sense? The reason I ask you to do that is because if you leave it as many pieces, it's going to make a texture for each piece. Does that make sense? So that's not the most efficient way. It's kind of complicated. You then have to assign new materials to each piece. For ease, for you guys, if it's a multiple pieced object, select all the pieces, Mesh Combine, and then do the steps I'm going to show you. That's a good question. I think it should. It should, because what it's going to do is create one ambient occlusion texture utilizing your UV layout of the 0 to 1, so it should be fine. But I'll test it. All right? So, select the geometry. We'll go to Arnold, and under Utilities, you will see Render Selection to Texture. It's pretty straightforward. What I want Arnold to do is the specific piece of geometry I have, render it into a texture. Don't give me an image, but give me a texture, an image that utilizes shadow information and the UV layout that I've created to make a picture. Does that make sense? Okay. So, when I do that, it's going to ask me some things, like the resolution I want. You can leave it at the default. That's fine where it's at. It's going to ask you about quality. The higher the number, the greater the quality. Does that make sense? It's fine at its default. Yeah, no, you don't have to make any adjustments. But what you do have to tell it is where to send it. Where the heck do I send that? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send it to my desktop. Well, actually, my project is set to my activity file folder. So by default, it's going to appear in here. I'm going to send it to my desktop just to make it easy to show you what's happening. But what I would tell you is if you set your project before you do this process, you know where the image is going to go. Does that make sense? It's going to tell you where it's going to go. It's going to give you the path, so you know exactly where to look for it. I told it specifically to go to the desktop just for ease of demonstration. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's going to my desktop. It's telling me that. So I just hit render. Here it's doing its thing. And you can see it does not take very long because the resolution of the image I was looking for was not very high. And I did not increase my samples or my anti-aliasing to make sure that the quality was way, way, way up. It's going to be fine at its default. But you will see what it created was this image right here. Hi, Maya. So pushy, Maya. Get out of the way. All right. So let's take a look at this image. This is the image it created. Okay? Can you see the parts of the jar on there? There's that like rib, right? That dark part, what do you think that is? The inside, right? What's that? The outside, right? The bottom. The inside, the shady part. Does that make sense? I see that. Just looking at that, I know it worked. Does that make sense? I can already tell it did the right thing. So again, knowing what you're looking at, you can tell if something went amok right from go. But here's this image that I created. And again, it recorded shadow information, because if you look, you can see the shadow. And you can see this is darker at the bottom, because at the bottom of my jar it will be darker, and as you get closer to the lip, it gets lighter. Makes sense. All right, so I've got this image. So the next thing I need to do is I need to close all these windows. Maya, you pushy, pushy. All right, here we go. Back out here. what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a project folder. First, I'm going to save this just to make sure. I'm going to save it. It's sending it to my skill check, but I'm going to send it to my desktop and say AO jar. And I'm going to send that bad boy to my desktop, again, just for ease of demonstrating what's going on. And it's an MB. The original is, I believe, an MB. Yep, it let me do it. So here's my Maya file. There's my image. What I want to do, though, is create a project folder, because I have to be able to tell Maya where to find all this stuff. You guys remember how to do that? File, project window, new project, AO project. Where do I want it? I'm going to put it on my desktop. Again, it's just easy to demonstrate that way. Leave all these at their defaults. So now I have my AO project, all of my folders and my workspace. So this is going to be a functioning thing. Where do I put my scene file? Where does this go? I have many folders. Which one? The scenes folder, absolutely. So I'm going to put that in my scenes folder. This is my texture. It's an image. Where do we put the images? Ah, tricky. Source images. Remember, that's where we put our textures. That's where we put our image planes. Anytime we're bringing pictures into Maya, Maya goes here by default. So I put that in my source images folder. And then now that that's locked and loaded, you know I want to set my project to it, because that's the one I'm working on. Desktop, AO project, set. So now my scene is contained. My Maya file's in there, my texture's in there, my project's set to it. So now I'm going to try to get that texture on my geometry. What's my geometry made of right now in terms of the material? Is it Lambert 1? Ooh, you could say it, don't be shy. The AO material, remember that special AO material that I created? It's just for capturing shadow. I don't use it for anything else. So guess what I have to do if I want to put this texture on my geometry? New material, absolutely. So, got to make a new material. Windows, rendering editors, Hypershade. I'm going to make a new material, only this one, plain old Lambert. All right, and I'm going to call this my AO material. I could call it jar texture, whatever, it doesn't matter. All right, so if I want to plug in a texture into my material, how do I do that? What's that? I go to the checker box, right, at the end of color. That's how I plug in pictures, right? We've done this several times. Click on the checker box. It opens up my Create Render node. What file, what node do I need? The one that's called File, right? Because that's how we get pictures in. So I click on File. And then the last step is I got to go here where it says Image Name and tell it what picture to put in there. So if I click on the little yellow folder, Maya immediately goes to my Source Images folder because I set my project, and I can choose that EXR file that I created, the texture. And I hit Open. So now the material has this in here. But don't forget, I still have to apply it to my object. Because I made the material, I plugged in the texture, but I didn't make the object made of that material yet. So again, middle mouse button, drag and drop. It's on there. What do I have to press to see texture? 6. Now wait a minute. What's going on? You guys see that? You can see like right through it, right? Something's crazy happening, right? Here's my color channel of the material. I can see that something's plugged in there. Ooh, transparency. There's something plugged in there too. I don't want it to be transparent, but something's plugged in there. So what I'm going to do is unplug it, right? Hover your cursor over the word transparency. Hold down the right mouse button and choose break connection. This will sever the tie to the transparency channel, and then now the object no longer has a transparency component to it, and now the object looks solid. And you can see, doesn't it look a little dirty now? That looks like a real object in terms of how it would behave and look in our world. Now, I do have this. What's that? This seam, right? And how do we fix that? Yeah, let's go to the UV editor. Do you guys remember last time what we did was we grabbed the UVs, on one side, grab the UVs on the other side. Oops, not grabbing the sphere, the round part on the bottom though. There we go. Got these guys and got these guys. Oh, it deselected them. All right. And then using my scale tool, I'm going to scale them so they move towards each other a little bit, which is what we did last time to get rid of the seam. So there's the seam. See that? And I don't have to scale if I don't want to. If scaling scares you, you can just grab those UVs and using your move tool, just tuck them in a little bit so that the UV shell is inside. You don't want to get that little shadowy area on the edge. That's what's giving you that texture seam. So I could just grab those guys at the ends and just tuck them in a little. And now that seam's not there. Do you think I can do the same thing for this seam right here and that seam right there? Absolutely. Same processes. Just tuck them in a little bit so that seam's not there. Because on the very edge of your ambient occlusion, there's going to be a little bit of shadowing out there. Tuck it in so that the shells are not touching that part. And then you don't see that part. Is that making sense? All right. So now Brian and I are going to walk around and see you guys create an AO pass for your jar. Now, hopefully you UV mapped it from the last exercise. We put checkers on it on Wednesday. So now we're going to try to create an AO pass for it. And by the way, do you think this might be part of your skill check? Absolutely. Your skill check for this class, you're going to create an AO pass for an object that we built. We already UV'd it. You don't have to do any of that, but you do have to create an AO pass. Trick question. It's made of many different pieces, so what are you going to have to do in your AO pass? Combine it, right? Don't forget that part. So remember to combine it because it is a multiple-pieced object. Good? Hell yeah? All right, so Brian and I are going to walk around and see how you guys are doing with the creation of an AO pass. Hopefully you wrote down the steps. There are many. And you got them in your utility belt of skills. We'll see how you guys did.
Anything else you want to talk about before I end the recording?
Oh, before I end the recording, what's due on Saturday? Skill check. You know it's skill check Saturday, right? So make sure those are turned in by Saturday. You know we have a week 3 turn-in on Monday. This one's a heavy one. There's more stuff we're looking for. We're looking for deleting history. We're looking for freezing transformations. I want to see edge quality. There's a lot of stuff going on there. In addition to which, you guys are going to do a test run at UV mapping a more complex object. 2 of the models that you guys turn in for your week 3 turn-in need to be UV mapped as well. Does that make sense? I don't need to see a texture. I don't need to see an AO pass. I just want to see nice looking happy squares on there. Okay? Does that make sense? Would you like me to open up an example of what that looks like? Okay. Let's take a look at week 3 turn-in. just so that you can see it. I think it's always a good idea to see an example of what is expected, but you know, not everybody necessarily wants to see that. So let's go to Documents, New Lecture. I believe it's in 7. Yep. No need to save that. So here I am looking at your turn-in for week 3. You will notice it's still 5 objects, and you will notice that 2 of them have been UV mapped. Now, you do have to UV map the objects, definitely. I'm only looking for happy squares on there, but I'm going to be looking for the different things that I'm looking for UV mapping. Make sure everything's blue inside the 0 to 1, make good use of the space, nobody on top of each other, right? This is a practice one. As long as you do it, you're fine. But you're going to get feedback on how to improve your UV layout, because guess what you're doing week 4? Yes, you're going to UV map a bunch of objects. No modeling, all UVing. Does that make sense? This is your chance to practice UVing, get some feedback on it, so that next week, week 4, you know how to do that. Make sense? Okay, and we've been UV mapping easy stuff so far. Jars, a cakewalk, cylinders and cubes and planes. When you start UV mapping more complex objects, it gets more difficult, more time consuming. So build time into your schedules to make sure you're doing that. Does that make sense? Did a hell yeah on that? Okay, thank you for reminding me that, Brian. So see you guys later, my digital friends. And again, Brian and I are going to walk around to make sure you guys can execute an ambient occlusion pass, because obviously that's going to be the thing for the skill check. And best of luck with that. If you're having trouble, come to the Google Hangout and work as a team, you instructors and or classmates. And we can help you work it out. So come see us. It's much easier with help, trust me. See you guys later. Thank you very much. Good class. Again, Brian and I are going to walk around and make sure you guys can do an AO. But that's all the material we're going to talk about today. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, somebody's got to pull the plug on me every once in a while.